Hey, gang, we're back again with Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Wealth Management to talk about something that to many people may seem silly, but apparently it is a mechanism that is effective on Wall Street for various investors, and that is, wait for this, astrology. Mark, are you kidding me?
No, I'm not. Larry, several years ago, I thought the same thing. A lot of other people thought this has just got to be ridiculous. And I have two stories on it. I was talking to a trader at Lehman Brothers at the time I worked on a prop desk, and he did a lot of trading for the hedge funds. And he wouldn't tell me what hedge funds did this, but he said, I will tell you, Mark, it's some of the hedge funds that you would love to work for and be just exactly like. And he said, what do you mean? I said, these guys have full-time astrologers on staff to predict moves in the stock market and the economy and stuff like that. And I thought he was stupid. But my second story was I was talking to another guy one time. He was the bond trader for Vining Sparks, ran one of the largest bond agency bond portfolios in the world. And Vining Sparks is headquartered here in Memphis. That's how I met him. And we're chit chatting stuff. And of course, he trades bonds, right? And he said, I was asking for some tips. And he said, Mark, I have two rules that I always live and die by. And don't make bond trades on the day of a Federal Reserve meeting, which makes perfect sense to me. And he also said, I don't make bond trades when there's a full moon. And I looked at him like he was stupid. And guess what? 20 years later, I won't do a trade on a full moon. I've learned the hard way. You just don't need to do it.
And what have you seen during full moons?
What you think's going to happen doesn't happen. I mean, you look at charts and go, well, I think based on the chart, it should do XYZ, but it doesn't do XYZ. It does ABC. I mean, it's just so, I mean, things, I mean, and I'm sure you've seen the studies during full moons, how people talk about how the birth rate, pregnant women tend to have more children or give birth more on full moons. In your large cities, you have the crime rate goes up. There's a reason why in ancient times they referred to crazy people as lunatics,
Lunatics.
lunatic being lunar. It's kind of
Yeah.
weird, isn't it?
And lunacy, yeah. Now,
Lunacy.
what other astronomical phenomena is apparent with the fluctuations in the job market, like Mars in retrograde or anything like that?
Yeah, this is the weird one. For some reason, when Mars goes into retrograde, the stock market becomes much, much more volatile. It has much bigger swings up and down. It doesn't matter. It may be they may be positive swings, maybe negative swings. But what I find so interesting, and it only happens when Mercury goes into retrograde for that small window, and other things, other astronomical events affect this also. What's so weird is in ancient times, Mercury was not only labeled, of course, everyone thinks of Mercury as the god of speed, but other aspects of the god Mercury was it's also the god of finance and it's also the god of thievery, which I find very interesting. How does the god become both the thief and finance at the same time? But on Wall Street, if you're a Wall Street guy, let's face it, you're a thief.
Yeah, that's totally in
Yeah,
keeping with the whole system there.
yeah.
Yeah. So, Mark, you've never been institutionalized for any kind of mental illness, have you?
I have not. And and this is the crazy thing. 30 years ago when I got in the industry, I would have sat here and I've been just like you, man. You guys are nuts if you think that's right. And after seeing it, after years of seeing it, I'm like, there's something very weird about this. There might be something really to this. It's just really weird.
What do you think might be to it? I mean, how would this work? Astrology?
Well, this is my personal opinion. Why I think it works is because markets move in cycles, right? Um, every 7 years the stock market goes into a slump. You can go back and you can trace it every 7 years. That's just a market cycle. Just like the during the parts of the year, you got a spring, you got a summer. They're very predictable because they're seasonal. And every 7 years, there's a seasonal factor that causes the stock market just to be weakened. Now, does that 7 years occur because people have seen it happen and they think it's going to happen again? So they basically try to make it happen again? Or every 7 years, Saturn and Jupiter are in conjunction with each other. Is Saturn and Jupiter being in conjunction with each other what causes it? Or is it just happen to be every 7 years the stock market runs into a bump because people expect it to, and it just happens to be that Saturn and Jupiter are in conjunction during that same period, and they're like, oh, it must be Saturn and Jupiter.
But I mean, this definitely does happen. You could definitely correlate astronomical movements with the stock market.
Correct. Just like when you say, when I think when Mars, which is the god of war, gets in conjunction with Jupiter, a war breaks out. And oddly enough, wars do tend to break out when Mars and Jupiter are in conjunction with each other. Who knows?
Yeah, and Mars is the god of war, right?
The god of war, yeah.
Wow. Right. Before my mind becomes any more boggled, we'll end this session, but with some real food for thought that there may be something to astrology after all. I mean, it could be some scientific mechanism that we don't fully understand, and modern man just attributes it to ancient superstitions, but who knows what that was correlated with. I mean, we're finding out all sorts of things, like nobody knew what electricity was, it even existed until it was discovered. Radio waves and all that that are all around us, invisible, undetectable through ordinary means, and yet they exist. So who knows what the mechanism may be scientifically that drives astrology.
One last thing, there was actually a guy named Dan on Wall Street back in 1908. 1908, there was this huge stock market decline. People call it the Great Financial Crisis, or even call it the financial panic, financial, depression or whatever. And he started studying up on stuff, and his hobby was astrology, and he started looking at astrology, and he finds out there's actually a pattern that when planets go through a certain conjunction every 100 years, you have huge sell-offs in the stock market, massive sell-offs. So guess what? In 1908, he actually predicted, based on his studies of how planets align and everything, that there'd be another major global financial crisis exactly 100 years later in 2008.
And it happened.
And it happened based on a guy that basically came up with this theory 100 years later. And Gann passed away in, I think, 1954. Didn't get to live to see his theory work out. But Gann would also, Gann looking at his patterns, he would look at, his theory basically, if you told him that like COVID occurred in, um, 2019, he wouldn't be surprised on that based on his 100-year cycle, because Spanish flu broke out in 1919, 100 years later. You look at the 1860s on his 100-year cycle. In the 1860s, what did you have? You had a civil war fought over the giving rights to black people, freeing the black people, and you had a president assassinated. Fast forward to the 1960s, 100 years later, you had the Vietnam War, you had the civil rights movement to give black people more rights, and you had a president assassinated. I don't think Dan would be too disappointed in his astrological predictions.
So what cycle is coming up next? How
Well,
far?
funny that you should mention that. Well, if you base it on the 100-year cycle, subtract 100 years from 2020, and you come with the 1920s, according to Gann, at some point here in the next roughly, 6 months to 12 months, we should start the roaring 20s, and we should see the stock market take off like a rocket up to the point, wait for it, until 1930, or in other words, 2030 comes around, and you should see some kind of repeat of the 30s as you did in the 1930s. Doesn't mean they will be as bad, but the similarities should be very, very close to each other based on Gann's predictions.
Wow. Well, I'm going to go out and see what's in retrograde here, so I could figure out where we're going to be. So, Mark, and I don't mean to mock this, because you've come up with some interesting research on this, and apparently it's being used on Wall Street all the time by some major investors. So,
And
Mark, thanks.
well, let's not forget, Ronald Reagan was rumored to have a full-time astrologer on his staff to help him make presidential decisions.
That's right. That's right. And the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, was very careful to look at the signs before anything momentous was going on there, Reagan administration. So, all right. So, Mark Collinsworth, to be continued. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Larry.